The air inside the Franklin County Courthouse felt heavy, thick with the kind of anticipation that settled over a room just before a storm. Spectators filled every seat in the gallery, their whispers an undertone of excitement, curiosity, and skepticism. At the defendant's table stood 19-year-old Lucas Carter, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared. The oversized wooden desk in front of him seemed designed for a man twice his age, yet he did not shrink beneath its weight. He did not look like a criminal. There were no shackles on his wrists, no signs of remorse in his posture. There was only a quiet defiance in the way he held his chin up, as if daring the room to underestimate him. Across the room, Judge William Harrington settled back into his chair. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen countless young men in the same position as Lucas. To him, this was nothing more than another routine hearing, another delinquent standing before the law with little hope of redemption. The way he drummed his fingers against the polished wood of his bench suggested boredom more than anything else. He peered at Lucas over the rim of his glasses, lips curving into something between a smirk and a sneer. "So you think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the room. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they were all in on the joke. Lucas did not flinch. He did not laugh. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one, of course. He had never planned on standing here as a defendant. But he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Angela Carter, had been a paralegal for over 20 years. Lucas had grown up listening to her stories of how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Harrington. To him, Lucas was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. Laughter again. This time it was different, felt sharper, more condescending. But Lucas barely reacted. Instead, the corners of his lips curled into the faintest smirk, because Harrington had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom had not noticed yet. Prosecutor Daniel Whitmore rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried the kind of rehearsed confidence that came from years of delivering the same speech over and over again. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Lucas Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 BMW M5, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The gallery murmured. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car. A chase. Running. Judge Harrington glanced at Lucas over his glasses, then turned back to Whitmore. "Go on." The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Carter is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Lucas for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Harrington leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Lucas did not blink. Whitmore continued, flipping through a stack of papers. Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Stephen Hale, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. Judge Harrington exhaled through his nose, nodding. Sounds straightforward to me, and for most people in the room it probably did. The case seemed clear-cut. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Lucas had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Harrington tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Lucas's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. Your Honor, my client. Lucas placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Lucas spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room went completely silent. Harrington stared at him, clearly amused. You'll what? Lucas's voice was calm, steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Whitmore's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Lucas took his first step forward. Because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around him as he adjusted his stance, his hands still in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, enough to make them uncomfortable. Then finally he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead. Lucas took a slow step forward. You said Officer Stephen Hale personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested. Correct. Whitmore exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his report. Of course it is. Lucas nodded, then turned to Judge Harrington. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Harrington squinted at him. On what grounds? Lucas pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Hale never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Whitmore's face. What are you talking about? Lucas took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Hale's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But he let the word hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. Now the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Harrington frowned, glancing toward Whitmore. Counselor. Whitmore cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Lucas gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't, he let the sentence trail off. Harrington studied him for a long moment, then turned to Whitmore. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Whitmore hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Lucas took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics, the way they played the system. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Whitmore was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Harrington sighed. rubbing his temple. "Counselor." Whitmore finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom like an approaching storm. The energy in the room had shifted. No longer was it filled with quiet amusement at the expense of a teenager out of his depth. Now there was something else. Uncertainty. Suspicion. Judge William Harrington rubbed his temple. His previous disinterest replaced by a new awareness. He had presided over hundreds of cases, some straightforward, some complicated, but this one had taken a turn he had not anticipated. Across the room, Prosecutor Daniel Whitmore adjusted his tie, his usual polished confidence showing its first crack. Lucas Carter remained standing, hands at his sides now, no longer buried in his pockets. His expression remained unreadable, but the fire in his eyes had not dimmed. If anything, it burned brighter. "Very well," the judge said finally. "The court will move forward with verifying Officer Hale's GPS logs. We will proceed once the records are available." The murmurs in the gallery were growing louder. Spectators exchanged glances, some leaning in to whisper their thoughts to those beside them. Some shook their heads. Others watched Lucas with something close to curiosity. But Lucas was not finished yet. "Your Honor, while we await those records, I would like to address another key piece of evidence in the prosecution's case." Whitmore, still trying to regain control of the narrative, scoffed. "This should be good." Lucas turned his attention to the jury, locking eyes with them one by one. His voice remained steady, measured, calculated. "The prosecution claims my fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That is their proof, their so-called smoking gun." He took a step forward. "But let's take a moment to think critically about this." The jurors shifted in their seats. A few furrowed their brows. Others sat up straighter. "Let's say you walk into a department store," Lucas continued. "You try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets. Maybe zip it up. Then you put it back on the rack and walk out." He let that image settle in their minds. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints were on it mean you stole it? The courtroom was silent again. A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. Lucas did not give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a convenience store hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked." He turned, this time looking directly at Whitmore. "I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity." He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, he asked the question that changed everything. "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Someone in the jury box shifted uncomfortably. Whitmore cleared his throat. He flipped through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Lucas was not finished. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned to Judge Harrington. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who conducted the fingerprint analysis subpoenaed to testify in this case?" Harrington blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Whitmore. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly admitted the truth. "No." A new wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Lucas nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. He let the silence linger before delivering the final blow. No chance for me to cross-examine. No chance to ask about the chain of custody. No chance to challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Lucas kept his gaze locked on him. Is that what we call justice? A hush fell over the room. Judge Harrington let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. Lucas had turned a once straightforward case into something far more complicated. But he was still not done. Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence an official statement from the registered owner of the vehicle. Harrington frowned. The owner? Lucas nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the name. The gallery watched in anticipation. Lucas continued. Mr. Whitaker provided a statement to the police the night his car was reported stolen. But for some reason, that statement was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. He turned to Whitmore, and I think I know why. Whitmore clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Lucas reached into the file he had brought with him. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers that night? Silence. Lucas didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript and began reading aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Lucas held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. His voice sharpened. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who does not even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Whitmore stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Lucas shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice did not rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. He let that hang in the air. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Harrington let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Lucas turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Judge Harrington cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Whitmore stood stiff, his face flushed. No, Your Honor. Harrington exhaled. He looked at Lucas for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence. Then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted. Some in disbelief. Some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Lucas did not move right away. He let the moment settle. He let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Harrington, still gripping his gavel, looked at Lucas with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe even regret. Lucas met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Carter. Lucas stopped, but didn't turn. Harrington hesitated, then finally said what he had been thinking. "You should consider law school." Lucas smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Lucas Carter stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the Franklin County Courthouse, his pulse steady, his breath slow. The case was over. The weight of wrongful accusation had been lifted, but something heavier remained pressing on his shoulders. Outside, the world seemed to be waiting for him. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like lightning in a summer storm. Their voices overlapped, a cacophony of questions thrown at him from all directions. "Lucas Carter, did you expect to win this case? Lucas, were you really preparing for law school before this trial? Lucas, how does it feel to have embarrassed the prosecution?" He ignored them. He did not need validation from the press, and he certainly was not interested in being a spectacle. This was not about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger. Pushing past the chaos, his eyes locked on a single figure standing at the bottom of the steps. His mother, Angela Carter. Her arms were crossed, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. She had sat through every minute of that trial, never speaking, never reacting more than necessary. But now, standing outside with nothing between them, her chest rose and fell with a heavy sigh. Lucas reached the last step, stopping just in front of her. "Boy, you scared me half to death." A breath of silence passed between them. Then, without warning, she pulled him into a tight embrace. Lucas let his shoulders relax just slightly. "Had to take a risk, Ma." Angela pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "You always were the stubborn one." He managed a small smile. "Learned from the best." She huffed, shaking her head, but there was no real anger in her face. Only pride. A fresh wave of camera flashes erupted from behind them. "Lucas, are you going to file a lawsuit? Do you believe the police targeted you because of your race? Are you planning on using this experience to advocate for justice reform?" Angela glanced over her shoulder at the reporters. "Lucas, let's go. We're not staying for this." She started walking toward their car, but Lucas remained still for a moment longer, watching the reporters, the police officers lingering near the entrance, the faces in the crowd that had gathered to witness a moment that should have never happened. How many times had this courthouse been the site of wrongful convictions? How many defendants had stood where he stood but did not have the knowledge, the preparation, the voice to fight back? He could have walked away and never looked back. But he knew the truth. This wasn't just about him. He turned to the reporters, ignoring their shouting questions, and spoke. This case should have never happened. The prosecution ignored key evidence. The arresting officers failed to follow basic procedures. I was accused not because of actual proof, but because I fit the profile they were looking for. The crowd quieted. This is not an isolated incident. This is what happens when people care more about closing cases than finding the truth. The only reason I was able to defend myself is because I spent years studying law. But what about the ones who didn't? What about the ones who couldn't? A hushed murmur swept through the reporters. The cameras kept rolling. Lucas took a slow breath. This isn't just about one case. It's about all of them. He turned away before they could throw more questions at him, walking toward his mother's car. As he reached for the door handle, he glanced back up the steps. Judge William Harrington stood at the top, his usual mask of indifference gone. He was watching Lucas with an expression that was hard to read. There was no arrogance in his stance anymore. No smirk. There was something else. Reflection. Maybe even regret. Lucas held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, just barely. The judge didn't nod back. but he didn't look away either. Lucas slid into the passenger seat of his mother's car. Angela wasted no time pulling out of the lot, weaving through the traffic that had built up outside the courthouse. The silence in the car stretched long. "You know they're going to keep talking about this," she finally said. Lucas kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Let them." Angela glanced at him. "You don't regret anything?" "No," she sighed, shaking her head. "Well, I do. You scared the life out of me in there." Lucas smirked slightly. "I knew what I was doing, Ma. That's what scares me," she muttered. Lucas turned to look at her. "You always told me the system was broken, that it wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about how well you could fight." Angela gripped the wheel tighter. "Yeah, and I also told you not to go getting yourself arrested. That was never the plan." She let out a dry laugh. "Good to know." The city blurred past them, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the buildings. Angela stole another glance at him. "You ever think about actually going to law school?" Lucas exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Angela nodded as if she had already known his answer. After another beat of silence, she added, "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Lucas looked out the window, the courthouse now far behind them. "No, Ma, I'm not." Because for every Lucas Carter, there were a dozen more who never got the chance to speak. A dozen more whose voices had been drowned out by the weight of a system that cared more about efficiency than justice. And if the system wouldn't fix itself, then someone would have to make it. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters,